Well, good morning, everyone. This is Jesse Heimer, a producer from Missouri, reporting from the northeast corner of our state today. I am currently a member of the National Pork Board, and it's my privilege today to bring this webinar to you about building pork demand. And today it's my privilege to introduce our two panelists, Dr. Glenn Tonser from Kansas State University. He's a ag economics professor there at K-State, a fellow Missourian, actually, who hails from nearly the same county as me here in the northeast corner of our state. And we're also joined by Kirsten Hafer, the Senior VP of Business Intelligence at the National Pork Board. And as many of you are aware, we have recently launched a brand new campaign about pork at the National Pork Board and Pork Checkoff. As a member of our board, we are very excited about this commitment to increasing the demand for pork, and an exciting new time to talk about what pork is and what it's not, and certainly to taste what pork can do. And it's my privilege to turn this presentation over to Kirsten and Dr. Tonser as they talk about building pork demand.
Thank you, Jesse. So we talk a lot at the National Pork Board, and you've certainly heard from us over the last 12 to 18 months about building consumer demand. But what it's really about is consumers demanding our product and consumers demanding pork. So we're thrilled to be here today to talk a little bit about what that means here domestically. And the reality is that 70% of our supply is domestic. That equates to about 20 billion pounds of pork that we have to make sure is relevant to consumers. So today we're going to talk about business intelligence and the journey that we've been on to build the foundation to the consumer work and the consumer marketing campaign that has launched recently. We know producers demand a focus on demand, and it's with good reason. And we are there to answer that call. The reality is consumers have changed more in the last 5 years than in the last 15. So it used to be everyone around the table and pork playing a critical role in being the centerpiece of the meal. Well, today people are on the move, lifestyles have changed. There's a lot of things that we have to solve for. There's a lot of noise in the marketplace, and consumers are eating different, which means pork has to show up different. So the question is, from a category perspective, how do we change consumer perceptions of pork? There are some really good perceptions of pork, but there are some things that quite honestly make it a challenge for consumers. So how do we really think about meeting them where they are and helping them understand what we have to offer? From a consumer perspective, it's about reaching the right consumers with the right content and the right messages in the way that they want and need to hear from us. From a product perspective, we have to replace some of the lost volume that we're seeing as consumers age out, as portion sizes become smaller, as they have more eating on the run and they're not consistently eating 3 square meals a day. How do we make sure that we stabilize our consumption and the volume? How do we unlock new growth potential? And from a consumption standpoint, how do we make sure that we move more of our portfolio, more of those pork products that we know and love, to everyday items? We know the consumer, and that's how we're going to do it. We have determined where they are and what they need from food and from pork, quite honestly. We know what they think, what they hear, what they feel, what they're eating, what they see, say, buy, and search. And we've boiled that down into what matters most, and that's taste and flavor, nutrition, and value. So we are now in a position where we can take that to all key stakeholders throughout the countryside and within the industry. So producers, states, packers, retailers, food service operators, and media are all hearing from us what we have found and know to be true about where consumers are and what they need from pork. We've been on that path for quite a while, and you've heard some of this along the way. We've been on a path to increasing pork's relevance. And again, we started with the consumer. So we have a lot to offer, and we have a lot to talk about that's inherent to what we deliver in value and in overall eating experience and just great product. But we had to start with the consumer and ask them what was important to them. And we listened. We continue to listen to them to understand what their challenges are, what their barriers to consumption are, and what they quite honestly need from us over the next 10 years. and we monitor that. And all of that is in an effort to help us position pork in the most favorable way, in the most relevant way. We've identified the path to growth, and as I've talked about, done a lot of the risk assessment work, understand what's at stake over the next 10 years as people change the way they consume food, as they change where they're buying and consuming the food they're buying. And we put a lot of work into a consumer segmentation that helped us identify specifically the path forward for pork and how to sell more. And we've got the blueprint for success. All of that was foundational to us building a consumer strategy, which is really how is pork going to meet consumers over the next 10 years? We led to then the work on the brand side and how are we going to position pork for now and into the future across a lot of different consumers that need a lot of different things from us. And that also then was leveraged into the marketing strategy and the marketing campaign that we'll talk about today. All of those things in an effort to increase the value of pork. So along the way, we learned a lot. And just to kind of ground you in where we are and what we learned, we know that the consumer base is shrinking. Our core pork consumer is aging out. They're consuming less. Their households are smaller. They are consuming smaller portions. So we have to replace that lost volume. And we know that that decline is reversible. And it's reversible by getting to a younger generation, to millennial and Gen Z consumers. But in order to do that, we can't do what we've done before. We can't market pork and talk to consumers like we did the boomers. Those younger Gen Z and millennial consumers need something different from us. And what they need is for us to help them understand how to get from the products that they know and love deeper into our portfolio and kind of over to those products that are a little more intimidating for them, primarily the fresh set. So we're going to use pork to sell more pork. And that's important because it also means that we have to transition from thinking about pork as a center of the plate option and item to pork as an ingredient and helping them integrate it into a lot of different things that they eat, cultural cuisine being top of the list. All of this is in an effort to create consumer pull-through. And what that means is that it's a little different than how we've showed up before as an industry. We typically have been pushing a lot of product into the marketplace and making it available on menus across the country or in retail locations in meat cases, behind the glass in a self-serve meat case. But that doesn't allow for consumers to really create an interest. It allows for us to put things in front of them. While we want them to really be recognizing that pork brings something that they can't get from other proteins or other eating experiences. So all of that foundational work, all of those learnings, all of that consumer understanding was leveraged into our new pork positioning and brand and the tagline, Taste What Pork Can Do. In this tagline, we talk to consumers across the board, every generation from across the country, people that were core pork consumers, people that were new to pork, people that wanted to explore pork. And what we found was they really valued calling out pork, taste, flavor, and versatility. So it's allowing us to now talk with those consumers that we know we need to be all in on our product. As you can see here, baby boomers are responsible for consuming a lot of fresh pork on an annual basis. Gen X is a pretty strong generation as well. But millennials and Gen Z aren't as comfortable and as confident in pork. So as we think about them eating pork less frequently, we need to make sure that we create awareness and that pork is part of their consideration. We know consumers are diverse and they're in charge, and 10 states across the country account for 50% of the US population and 50% of fresh pork consumption. So as we think about National Pork Board's efforts to reach consumers and where they are, we are going after the consumers in those states that are high population, sometimes low production, and high consumption states. We are going to maximize the impact of the marketing efforts by getting to those consumers and getting to them often and getting them to a position of understanding what pork has to offer and giving them some really good reasons why they should try and repeat pork. So what do we want and need? We want and we need consumers to eat more pork more often. And as we think about the segmentation and everything we learned about the different consumer segments, we're leveraging that throughout the marketing efforts. So we have 3 segments that are very core to the marketing efforts. I've got this, the confident meat eaters. They are huge pork consumers, they're pork fans, and they are responsible for 20% of meat case sales. We have to make sure that we hold on to them and hold on to their consumption. As we think about Up for the Challenge, the culinary adventurers, they're about 17% of meat case sales, and they love to explore, and we want them exploring cultural cuisines and eating experiences with pork. I Make Conscious Choices, the mindful choice makers, they care about where their food comes from. They're reading labels. They really want to consume things that are good for them. They are definitely all in on nutrition. And we know a lot about our portfolio and how to bridge that gap between nutrition and everyday usage. So they are a core consumer for us in the marketing efforts. All of these segments represent opportunity for pork, all of them important, but National Pork Board is going to hone in on these 3 segments because they create the biggest opportunity for us to really change consumer perception and move the needle with pork. And Dr. Tonser, I would love for you to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with the Meat Demand Monitor that helps us understand whether or not the segmentation work is on track and on target.
Yeah, happy to do that. As a quick background for those that aren't familiar, the Meat Demand Monitor is a project based here at Kansas State University. It is funded by the Pork and the Beef Checkoff. And since February of 2020, I would describe it as a very deep dive into domestic meat tracking, consumption, demand, preferences, whole lots of things. Everything from it is available on our Ag Manager website. Specific to the slide in front of you, in 2024, we used the MDM data to corroborate the segmentation conclusions that the Pork Board has. And to kind of hold our hands on that a little bit further, is in 2023 was the bulk of the segmentation research that the Pork Board was doing with another group. This was not using the K-State or MDM-led data. And what I'm trying to clarify for you is the MDM data was used sort of after the fact to confirm the same segmentation conclusions. So there's a table in front of you. You have 7 segments that the Pork Board is labeled, and across the top are the MDM data suggest for the March through September of 24 period, and how that compares with the segment sizes that the Pork Board had with the 2023 efforts. And there's some variation, 2 to 3% in some segments. But what I really want to impress on you is the composition and the size of these segments is very similar when we use the MDM data as we were with the initial MPP conclusions. That ought to give us confidence that we have the segmentation done right to go further with this. To drive that point further, not just is the composition and the size identified, consistently across different data sets is what I'm trying to highlight, but there's deeper insights from the MDM specific to demand. So this is, this whole campaign is about building pork demand. The Meat Demand Monitor is more than just pork, right? Hence the name meat. It is multi-species. We track lots of things. 2 of the pork categories that we track in the most depth are pork chop and bacon demand. What you have in front of you is another table that's in that segmentation report from back in 24. And across those 7 segments, I can tell you how they compare in their demand and narrowly their willingness to pay at the retail counter separately for pork chop and bacon. And I'm going to use bacon as just my example here, but we can do the same thing for pork chop. So if in your eye, go to the middle of the slide, you'll find bacon, and move to the right, you will see both green and red showing up. The green boxes are cases to where a segment is willing to pay 10% or more above the national average. So their demand over indexes compared to the country. Red is a segment that has a 10% or less decline compared to the national average. So for every one of these products, you'll find at least one segment that's green, at least one that's red is the point. I'm going to call out 2 segments first here. The culinary adventurers, and I'm doing it because it's the easiest one, it's the first column. They are green for all the proteins, not just the pork items. So they over-index in demand. Their willingness to pay is above national average in everything we're looking at. Specific to bacon, you'll see the number 125. They're willing to pay 25% more than the national average for a retail to grocery store. So we interpret that. Conversely, as you go to the right, I'm going to call out the tasty value seekers because you can learn from the contrast here. Note both for pork chop and bacon, those values are 81, 82%. So the demand from tasty value seekers for those two pork items is almost 20% below the national average. This is important to highlight because it's embedded in some of the generational differences. That group tends to be a little bit older, and that group tends to be more price sensitive. And the industry historically has leaned on them for volume movement, not necessarily demand growth. And that distinction, I lose a lot of hair talking about that difference between consumption and demand for those who've heard me before, but it is a very important one here. Please note the demand differences are real across these segments.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Tonser. We could not agree more. That tasty value seeker is really important to the industry and more specifically the category, but they are not a loyal consumer. They are definitely moving about the retail segment. With that being said, we've spent a lot of time taking this segmentation, learning and understanding, and the meat demand monitor work to the industry so that everyone can leverage it and benefit from it. So as we think about National Pork Board's Consumer Connect segmentation study, we've shared it with packer and processors. We've shared it with food service operators and allied industry partners, with our state partners, and certainly retailers, so that everyone can benefit from those key learnings. Now it's an opportunity for us to take that and the marketing campaign and do the same. So as we thought about the data insights analytics journey, we've brought all of these same groups along with us. They were a part of the segmentation build and launch and now activating against it. And it's really the opportunity to do the same with the consumer campaign. So we had states and packers, producers, and some board members along as we were building and leveraging everything we had learned about the consumer into what you now know as our new marketing effort. And that's important because none of it's a surprise. We're all ready to rally around what we know consumers need from pork and what we know will help us ultimately grow beyond where we are today. And the reality is we are at a crossroads, right? Pork is first in the world, but third in the US. So we have some opportunity as a category. We know from a consumer perspective that Gen Z and millennials crave taste and flavor and balance and convenience and versatility, and we are certainly ready to rise to that occasion. And from a product perspective, that pork is seen as occasion only, and we are certainly anchored in a lot of very key moments in consumers' lives, but we need to move to more everyday consumption, as we talked about. And as we've talked about the data journey, there's also been a journey from a marketing perspective and how we're thinking about driving domestic demand. In the 80s into the early 2000s, the other white meat served us well. It's what we needed at the time. It's how pork was going to succeed at the time. But as the consumer is evolved, as life stages change, as the world around us has evolved, we move to don't be blah or be inspired because consumers needed a little bit more. They needed some creative inspiration. We then moved to helping the supply chain in the B2B world really understand how to bring pork to market. And then we moved deeply into multicultural marketing, really testing and learning what we thought would be possible if National Pork Board were to invest and proving it out in real world application, focused on nutrition and focused on being part of a plant forward diet because we know that's how consumers were consuming. So that allowed us to really test and learn what we've determined in the data if it would be relevant in a real world application. So through 2022, we focused on Hispanic marketing and really started then to elevate some specific products within our portfolio, continued our consumer research, rolled out segmentation, and got even tighter and more specific about what the opportunities were, which gets us to where we are today. And that's taste what pork can do. And it's the opportunity to represent what's most important for the entire category and industry and portfolio of products to bring to consumers. So what's different about where we were on that journey and where we are now? And there are three things that come to mind. We are unapologetic about who we are and about pork. We're celebrating processed, we're celebrating fresh, we're celebrating the entire hog. It's about everything we bring to market and everything we have to offer. And we're not the other anything. We're stepping into the data, which is in our control. We are not asking people to tell us what we should be doing or how we should be doing it. We're owning that, and we're owning the metrics that guide those decisions for success. And we're partnered with folks like Dr. Tonzer so that we can make sure that we're taking an unbiased approach to evaluating our success. And we've brought the industry along. So they've been at the table from day one, talking about what the opportunities were, what the risks were, where and how we should bring this forward to market. So the industry is supportive and ready to activate and embed what you're seeing here today in their own business for their own brands. So as we think about how that all comes together and how we arrived at a new brand position, a new campaign, and a new tagline, it's helpful to really understand what the brand is that sits under that. So from a vision standpoint, our goal is to make pork #1 in flavor. So consumers will really think about pork as leading the flavor game, and to be #2 overall in terms of animal-based proteins. And we really want to expand from special day to everyday. We want to make sure we have an emotional connection. It's not just about features and benefits and not just about the things that we know are specific to how pork performs, but it's about the fact that they already have pork anchored in some of the most special moments of their lives, whether it's a Sunday breakfast with a loved one or a barbecue with friends and family, or the centerpiece of a holiday meal. Our goal now is to bridge those anchors in their everyday life and make sure that they understand that pork can provide that authentic flavor, that unapologetic enjoyment. It can help them with their own self-expression and creativity, make memories, and do it in a way that's responsible and full of product that comes from an industry that cares. So ultimately, our brand promise is that we bring flavorful moments to everyday life. And that really comes to life in the work that we're doing to make sure that they understand that pork can be more. There was a then, there was a what their grandmother did or their mother might have done, but there's certainly a now, and there's an opportunity to move beyond weekends or holiday timeframes to everyday flavor fixes. And we're really going to lean into taste and flavor. As you can see, it's represented in the tagline, it's part of the brand. We are definitely leading with and attaching taste and flavor to pork and versatility. And that's really important because Dr. Tonzer, you've also done a lot of work around taste, and maybe you can share a little bit of what you found.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Before I do, realize we failed to tell the group. You're welcome and encouraged to type in a question in the Q&A function. So as a reminder, we're part of the way through the webinar. We encourage you to do that, and to the extent we can, we'll address those at the end. You teed up the taste component here for me to clarify on the MDM, because taste is what's leading this campaign, and it is very consistent with what we see in the Meat Demand Monitor. What you're looking at now is a slide that I call the protein values slide. So remember, the MDM is a big national survey that we've been doing since February 2020. Every US resident that's taken that survey is asked a simple question. Of these 12 things, what are the 4 most important factors when you decide or decide not to buy protein? And what are the 4 least? And of course, the other 4 are intermediate. So I know for every person, your top 4, middle 4, bottom 4. And that's a zero-sum kind of exercise, because you can't tell me all 12 things are most important, which to me, that's intuitive, because by definition, 12 things aren't most. That's why the question works that way. But taste is the biggest number that's up in front of you, and freshness is very similar to it. I'm going to clarify that number and drive home why this is really important for the campaign. So the 0.43 number is what you're looking at. In April of 25, which is the most recent data we have, 43% of the public 43% more of the public told us taste is a top 4 consideration compared to the group that said it's a bottom 4. Contrast that with, to the far right on this chart, environmental impact. So there's a negative 0.5 there. So there's 50% more people that consider environmental impact a bottom 4 than there are the number considered at top. So if you sum up those 12 numbers, it's a sum 0. Taste is a predominant leading factor on whether I do or don't buy meat protein, is the punchline of that. I also want to call out, so there's 12 things here. I'm not going to interpret every one of them, but price you will find is listed 4th. It's actually the 3rd highest. So there's a 0.27 there. So 27% of the public is more in the top 4 versus the bottom 4. Same interpretation. What's really important here is we cannot ignore price. We all know price matters in a purchasing decision, but please note that taste and freshness are ahead of it. So the typical US resident considers taste more important than price. The typical person considers price more important than appearance and everything else to the right, as we interpret this. But there is a willingness to pay more for a product that is either deemed tasty or fresh, because they both rank out higher here. And that's very consistent with the conclusion that taste leads. This is just a broad MDM kind of point. And a lot of the stuff that, Kirsten shared earlier gets a lot deeper and pork specific in different generations and so forth. But we persistently see taste leads.
Yeah, and we eventually have to address all of these things that consumers care about. And the reality is that we can use taste as the point of entry into that discussion. So now we want to share a little bit of the creative and the marketing support that you will start to see in market. We love all the data charts. Dr. Tonzer and I love sharing with you the path and the data and the confirmation that we've gotten through all of these data sources. But the reality is you want to see how it comes to life. And here we go. Here is a consumer video that will be launched as part of the campaign and is likely already in market in some of the areas of the country where some of you joining live and eat. So we're happy to share with you this first video of the consumer effort.
Pepperoni. It's why pizza exists. Pizza's just the delivery device for those bubbly, crispy-edged slices of savory spice. And that's just one small slice of pork. So sear, sauce, shred, air fry, flip, dip, zest, and discover all the incredible flavors that make up every delicious bite of pork. What are you waiting for? Taste what pork can do.
So in this video, you heard a lot of keywords. You heard savory, sear, sauce, shred, air fry, flip, dip, flavor. It's all the things that consumers have told us are important to them. It's the things that are going to grab them. It's selling more pork using pork, right? We bring them in on pepperoni. We bring them in on some of the processed and right over to the things that pork can do for them. And it's really important because it's quick hits. It's creating that moment that stops them and gets them to reconsider what pork can do for them. And it really is focused on flavor-filled moments. So we're turning pork dishes into a flavor fest that starts in their feed and keeps them going into their kitchen. So you're going to see pork in cultural cuisines. You're going to see light, bright. You're going to see flavor come through and fly off of the screen. And you're going to see applications like bowls that are really relevant to those younger consumers. Here's another example of some of the creative and the look and the feel that you should expect. And what we're doing is really making pork hero. But what's a little bit different is it's not a raw cut. It's not what you would find in the grocery store in the meat case. It's the finished dish. It's the thing that they crave. It's the eating experience or the flavor profile or the color that consumers want. So we're calling out things like ginger pork noodle bowl. Noodle bowls are huge. It's a trend among younger consumers. Gen Z consumers love Asian cuisine. So we're calling out how pork plays a role in a format that they're already consuming. And we're highlighting spicy so that if they want a flavor adventure that packs a punch, they can turn to the ginger pork noodle bowl. On the right, you see balsamic glazed pork tenderloin, and we're really highlighting there that it's easy. So we know that consumers need versatility and they need convenience and they want things that are easy go-tos. So we're now positioning pork in a way that allows them to explore and do something different with pork that's identified as it's an easy way to enjoy. So it allows for us really to, again, reposition pork, lead with taste and flavor, and bring what we have to offer to the consumer in a new and different way. As we think about that, and as we think about all of the work that was done and all of the data that was leveraged to get to the recipes, the flavor profiles, the formats that you're going to see used throughout the consumer marketing, that was all based on data and understanding exactly where those consumer segments were and what they need from us and how they need to explore their food choices. It doesn't stop there. So as we think about now executing in market, we are going to measure the success of the campaign and the success of us reaching and changing consumer perceptions. We're going to understand how showcasing high flavor pork products is working. We're going to know if we're attracting new consumers to those high value pork products. We're going to create pork dishes that consumers want and customers want. And we're going to develop products that consumers need. And we're going to measure all of those investments. We're going to do it not only at a total US level, but through the lens of the consumer segmentation, so that we're clear that we're meeting the consumers on their terms. So as we think about that, that's again where a lot of the partnerships that we've established come into play. So Dr. Tonser is a part of that measuring success and the scorecarding and the dashboards and the criteria that we've identified. So business intelligence was certainly part of fueling the development of the marketing efforts. It's certainly part of fueling the category growth. It'll be part of innovation, and it will certainly be part of the success measurement. So with that, you're probably wondering, do these investments and does building pork demand matter to hog producers? And we've got an answer for you. And Dr. Tonser, I'd love to turn it over to you for your thoughts on whether or not these investments and National Pork Board's efforts in building consumer demand are going to pay off in the long run for hog producers.
Yeah, happy to respond to that and share some related resources. It ties directly into the ROI component that was on the last slide. All right, if you're an individual producer that's a checkoff contributor, it's a natural question. So it's an important one we should not take lightly. And I'm happy to deal with that. Next slide. In short, my answer would be yes. And I'm going to geek out on this for a little bit because that's my job. But economists like myself and Lee Schultz, and I'm going to describe his work here a little bit, that you guys have heard talk in the past, would anticipate that if there is a growth in consumer demand for a product you produce, you're going to be better off. Now, I'm saying that in the least jargony way I can first. And now I'm going to get a little bit more jargony because I think there is value in being specific on this question because it does really matter. So there is a link to a report that Lee Schultz and Ezra Butcher, which Ezra's finishing his PhD up at Iowa State. I encourage you, if you're not familiar with that, to bring up that report. And they quantify these effects. And I'm aware of these effects for other industries and species, but I'm not aware of a parallel study for the pork sector. So this is a timely contribution. I would be highlighting this even if we weren't talking about this campaign. The fact we're doing it at the time the campaign's coming out is quite fortuitous, so that's great. And there's green numbers in front of you, and they are green for a reason, because this is a positive story that supports an answer yes to the question. What Ezra and Lee quantify is if we have a 1% increase in wholesale pork demand, and it doesn't matter how we accomplish that, but if you have an increase in pork demand, historically, we observe a 0.7% increase in market hog price. And I'll pause on that part specifically first. So if you are selling market hogs, you're selling obviously at a higher price, you benefit from that, right? So if you have a finishing facility, you benefit from that in that example. Why does that happen, or how does that happen? It's a notion of derived demand is what economists would describe this as, is that end user demand is increasing, which is pulling up wholesale level demand. And when I say end user, it'd be somebody like me buying a pork chop. I'm an end user in that example. Wholesale pork demand goes up with that. And those that are selling those wholesale pork products then are able and competitively do pay more for market hogs because now they want to do that more, right? So that's the pull up factor on market hog prices. Keep going with that. When we see a higher expected market hog price, we also historically see higher feeder pig and wean pig prices. And that's what's the rest of the slide. So almost 2%, 1%, transmissions on those is how those are described. But again, that's further derived demand. So if I run a finishing facility and I think I can sell my hogs for more, all else equal, competitive environment, we start paying more for the hogs coming in because we want to do that. So again, then feeders and wean pig sellers are benefiting. So throughout the system, those that have live animals historically benefit when you have a wholesale pork demand increase, and that's great. I will add to this that the opposite occurs too. When you have a demand challenge, we see these prices go the other direction. So that's not as fun to talk about, but the market mechanisms are the same. And that's sort of the cost of doing nothing if you fall behind, is why I interjected. Next slide, please. Most of us here are well aware of the profitability challenges in the hog industry in 2023 and early 2024. One of the things that Ezra and Lee do in this report that I really like, because I think this makes it tangible, is takes that recent experience and does a very targeted what if. And the what if they walk us through in this report is, what if wholesale pork demand would have stayed the same that it was in 2022 throughout 2023? And that, of course, did not happen. There was a demand decline that occurred in 2023. But if we would have avoided that, how much higher live animal prices would we have seen? And you can see in front of you, it's 4 to 5% higher live animal prices, depending on what weight class and stage of production we're talking about. I suspect our listeners can relate to that because it's fairly recent memory of the 2023 profitability challenges. They, in part, were due to some demand challenges. And if we could have mitigated that, you would have seen higher live animal prices. The same goes forward, like looking forward, if 2026 wholesale pork demand is higher because of the campaign or for any other reason, I would anticipate higher live animal prices as well. Next slide. So I use this term derived demand. I know that's pretty geeky. I did it on purpose because hopefully you followed my comments about like how the market mechanisms work. So if end consumers value pork more and are willing to consume more at the same price either way, that has a competitive environment that pulls up the value of wholesale pork. That feeds its way back all the way to ultimately the seed stock. And I didn't share seed stock information with you today. I just ended with, 10 to 12 pound wean pigs, but the same market mechanisms are there. Now those are quantified. So thanks to Ezra and Lee's work, they are now quantified. Hopefully, per that 2023 example, you agree that they're substantial. I would argue those are very relevant, for an industry this size. 4 to 5% price effects are very big. And I capitalize much on this slide. I think this is very important and warrants much, much wider appreciation. The production side of our industry is much more comfortable with supply side metrics than demand. I've lost a lot of hair talk about that over time. But this particular one is really important, and it's a timely contribution for this campaign. Next slide. So I like this slide. Several of our listeners, have watched If You Build It, Will They Come? The baseball analogy, Iowa cornfield, right? The question producers that are looking at this campaign and hearing about it are probably asking, if we invest in this, will they come, right? If we make this investment, will the pork demand boost come? And to go further, if we have the demand boost, will I, as a live animal producer, be better off? Hopefully you follow my last few slides. I'd say the answer to that is yes. So I'm optimistic on that. Next slide. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic is the timing feels right. So the timing feels right because we're in a pro-meat protein environment. And this is more than just pork at the moment, but the broader US environment is very pro-meat protein. In front of you is data. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and USDA, a 25-year history of expenditures for each of the three main species. Please note they're upward sloping. Next slide. Here's for the real geeks that are out there. How upward sloping are they? The pork numbers, so this is the dotted black line is the pork expenditures, and the simple trend line fit to that over 25 years is on average, pork expenditures in the US have went up by about $4.50 per year. And that's great. I want to highlight this can continue to go up or go up faster by enhancing demand. And importantly, demand enhancement can either be more pounds at the same price or the same pounds at a higher price. Both of those are outcomes from an increased demand. One of them is a higher quantity, right? But at a higher, but the price doesn't have to change. And there's different mechanisms for this. I'm trying to be clear, because over this 25-year history for all species, there's points in time where the available pounds goes down or available pounds goes up. That alone doesn't guarantee anything about demand change, because you got to know what the subsequent price response was to draw a net demand conclusion. And I like to start with this expenditure component because most of us know expenditures is price times quantity, and monitoring the result of those two is part of this broader discussion. And it's a lot more than just the quantity part. To my comment earlier about consumption and demand are not the same. We're in a pro-meat environment. I'm going to drive that home the next few slides, but that distinction about the price and quantity patterns is really important. Next slide, please. So to that point on understanding these price responses and price relationships, myself and Jason Lusk, who's now a dean at Oklahoma State, have done some work for National Pork Board over the time. That is part of the background and information that helps shape the strategy and the campaign on this. Specifically, what I'm alluding to here is using Circana, or previously IRI, market data. So for about 50 US, the larger 50 US regions. So think Chicago versus LA versus Miami, that kind of level. And then loin versus belly, so forth. So we have some cut level kind of insights in the pork space by city that gives us a lot of information about how price sensitive the public is. The reason I include it here today is one of the questions that comes up is, what about quote unquote competitors? So beef and chicken price, what's going on in their industries? How does that impact pork demand? And one of the key lessons from this work and others that have done similar work in the last decade is there's less sensitivity of pork demand to what's going on in the pork and chicken space than there was 20, 30 years ago. And I'm going to say that again, is what's most important to observed pork purchasing behavior is things that goes on within the pork space. The effect of beef and chicken industry status, volume on the market, their offer prices and so forth, those exist, and I'll never ignore them, right? Because we understand there's cross-price effects, but those cross-price effects are not as large as a lot of people historically thought they were. And at this point in time, I think most of us are aware, for example, beef prices are pretty high, and a question comes up, quote unquote, why hasn't pork gained more on that? I point to this study and related ones is, it is favorable to pork in that environment, but maybe not as much as you think, because most of these purchasing decisions are sort of siloed by species compared to what they were 20, 30 years ago. Next slide. My pro-meat comment, again, I love this picture, by the way. So this is a link to an article in the Atlantic back in March that I helped provide some background context on. And the shout out, and the reason I bring it here, is not only do we have a multi-year gain on consumer expenditures, there's been growth in the last 3 or 4 years per the MDM data in self-declared, I'm a meat consumer. So one of the things we ask is, do you consider yourself a regular meat consumer, a flexitarian, a vegan, vegetarian? And there's been a decline in the self-declared rates of vegan vegetarianism since about 2021. And there's been an increase in the self-declared, I'm a regular meat consumer. So that broader, this is a pro-meat protein environment. There's a GLP-1 effect to that. There's a younger group that's exercising more than the past. It's part of that. There's a lot of reasons for that we can talk about, but the timing seems right for seizing on that for pork. Next slide, please. And to that point, I would encourage us to focus on growing the size of the economic pie. And the best advice I have to do that is to grow demand for your product, which in this case is pork, rather than focusing on the size of the pie in the past and what share your industry might be getting of that. Keep in mind my comments about cross-price effects and so forth. They're not as large as we think, is one of the reasons for that suggestion. And the broader one is, as you grow the size of, if you grow demand for an industry, you grow the economic resources of that industry. That tends to help most stakeholders, including hog producers in this example. Next slide. So to put a final bow on that, we're focused on domestic US industry. I actually think globally, the public wants meat protein. So we purposely are focused on domestic today because it's a domestic campaign. But those comments about it being a meat protein moment, they apply throughout the world. And pork has an opportunity to seize on that. And I believe this is my last slide before we kick it over here to Jesse, but a copy of my slides will be available. And I went pretty quick and it was small font, but several of the things from Meat Demand Monitor in particular, the Circana study I referenced and so forth, they're all available from our Ag Manager website. And if you can't find them or have related questions, you're always welcome to email me.
Thank you, Dr. Tonser, and thank you, Kirsten. Certainly appreciate your perspectives. And as a board member, I think all of this data is really important. And Glenn, you actually alluded to this, and as a board, we talked about the reality as we look at the future and as we look at the demand curve and we look at everything we've learned from segmentation over the last 2 years. The cost of doing nothing one could argue is far greater than the cost of what we're doing. And as we think about that as a board and the decision that we made as a board to commit producer dollars to this effort, there was significant discussion, but I can assure you that as a board, we are completely rallied around this effort and we're very excited about it. As a producer, when I think about decisions that I make on farm and I think about my colleagues and the decisions that they make on the farm, historically, we have always relied on data for everything we do, whether it's nutrition, genetics, equipment, a new vaccine, or a new way to keep our pigs healthy. We continuously look to the data to make that decision. And so as producers, I would encourage those that are listening or those that listen to this later to think about it this way. We're actually taking a deep dive into consumer data to make these decisions. This isn't a gut feel. This isn't something that we just up and decided to do. The National Pork Board, the Pork Checkoff, Kirsten's team has done a remarkable job over the last couple of years of gathering the correct data, analyzing that data, and making a sound decision based on that. And the neat part about this webinar is that Dr. Tonser's work at K-State is confirming the same thing. And so, building demand for pork, this isn't just a whim. This is founded or grounded in the data. And I think as a producer and as a member of the board, I want to make sure that point is very clear. I had the privilege as a board member to be in New York City a couple weeks ago as the campaign was launched. And in the Midwest, it's so easy to think about pork in our bubble and how we view pork until you go to the big city and you see 8 million people walking around that view pork much differently than I do. And I would argue view pork much differently than you do if you're listening. And so to that, I'm very excited about the campaign and the approach that we're taking. I believe we're coming up here on a 10-minute spot here for Q&A. And I want to remind folks that if you've listened and you have an additional question, please type that into the Q&A box. But we do have a couple questions that I would like to get to, and hopefully we'll have enough time to work through these. Jill Ressler from Minnesota asked, as state partners, we have heard that the National Pork Board Market Growth Team, as they share this work about the pork producer, not for the pork producer. And her question is, how will pork producers, including those in Minnesota, see this campaign in action? And I believe Kirsten's got an answer to that question.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Jill. And I really think it starts with a little discussion around the different roles that all of us will play in the consumer campaign and in consumer demand creation overall. So National Pork Board, being your national organization, will start the conversation, and we'll start the conversation to create some awareness and consideration, as I said earlier, really around relevance and perceptions of pork. So when we start that will be out there now. I'll talk tactical, on a tactical level. We'll be in markets where we know they're really important to convert and win consumers. We're trying to win their hearts versus their mind in a lot of ways. So you'll see Taste What Pork Can Do out there in social media. You'll see it in the digital space. It could be on a website that they frequent a lot to get their news information, as an example. You'll see it through influencer partnerships. So some of those things, although they may be starting in a regional focused area, do become national. So you may end up seeing that as somebody that lives in Minnesota. As we think about, though, the other roles that everybody plays, including states and retailers and packer processor brands, you start to layer that, and then you start to see that we are covering the entire country. And we're getting to those core states in the Midwest that are very different, as Jesse pointed out, in their perception and understanding of pork. So what you might see is Taste What Pork Can Do, very specifically funded by NPB in the states that I shared earlier in today's presentation. Then you'll have some of your own state work where you may want to cascade that messaging to your consumers and communities to accomplish something very specific in your state. There will be certainly packer processors that are integrating a lot of the same messaging. So you may not see them use Taste What Pork Can Do because they have their own business and brands that they want to advance and promote. But what you will see from them is a focus on taste and flavor, nutrition, convenience, and versatility. So as you start to layer all of these things, and then you think about retail activation or food service activation on menus in restaurants with LTOs, you will see consistent approach to how we position pork. So it may be through the lens of what they're trying to achieve for their specific retail store or their meat program or their brand and product, but focused on those messages. And then Taste What Pork Can Do, certainly through the work that MPB, its state partners, and the market development team and their direct retail relationships and operator relationships will yield as well. So hopefully that helps bring some clarity. And ultimately, we will be tracking that and understanding how far does the messaging get and how far does Taste What Pork Can Do reach over time as we now engage in the media plans.
Jesse, if I may do a real quick add on to that as well. I think it's important to remember, think about the lower 48 states we have in the US. There's already notable differences in consumption patterns, demand patterns. There's already pre-existing generational, cultural, differences and so forth that already lead to differences in what we talk about pork demand in Florida versus Minnesota versus California, whatever examples you want to use. And now some of this is going to get sort of magnified by this campaign. And I would encourage us to think about that's okay in aggregate for the following reason. I pointed out Schultz and Butcher's work on the effect of a wholesale pork demand benefit. At that level for the industry, for economic benefit of livestock producers, it sort of doesn't matter where the consumer demand boost is, but a boost will have the effect of boosting wholesale pork demand, right? So you will benefit if you're a Minnesota hog producer by there being a demand enhancement in Florida, is the point of that comment, right? Now, you may not see all the mechanisms all the same. I understand that comment, but my job here to interject is, livestock producers benefit sort of no matter where the demand enhancement occurs. And the more the merrier, and the more we see it, the better. I get that. But you benefit no matter where that realized demand increase occurs.
And one last build on that, and thank you for that additional thought. We have leveraged all of the National Pork Board's assets as we bring this to market for National Pork Board spends, but also for all of you to use. So we have HighSpot, which is now going to be the tool where you can access all of the videos, all of the creative, all of the campaign elements that you can take and start to use in your own efforts. And we're offering that to retailers and we're offering that to food service operators. So again, we want to make sure that this is benefiting the industry at large, and we are working to ensure that everyone has those elements that they need in order to successfully leverage the opportunity that we've identified and is at hand for pork.
Thank you, Kirsten and Glenn, and thanks, Jill, for that question. I want to move here to Colby Ferguson in Texas, and Colby's referencing conversations with Gen Zers and millennials and their busy schedules, and they certainly lean on convenience. And I'm not a Gen Zer or a millennial, but as a parent of teenagers, we lean on convenience around here as well. Processed pork, we know where processed pork is, but is the campaign looking at fresh in this convenience spot?
Yeah, absolutely. So Colby, yes, thank you for that question. And you're absolutely right. So there's a couple of things that you will see, and the video was a great starting example where we're taking some of the things that those consumers might be going toward. Pizza, very convenient, right? It's a staple in our household. We're going to move them to the fresh side of the portfolio and give them very quick, very easy, simple ingredient opportunities. And we called out things like air fryer. I too have some Gen Zs, right? And they cook in the air fryer every day. So we're going to make sure that we are not only mapping to what consumers want in terms of eating experience and cultural cuisine, but cooking appliances to make it convenient. And then there's certainly a huge opportunity for us to think about classes of trade and where people are actually purchasing. So we will support traditional grocery, we'll support club and mass, and we will be thinking certainly about things like convenience stores, where we know a lot of those consumers are going to grab quick snacks. So we will continue to push pork further. We will start with what we've got and just really repositioning and making our recipes and our marketing relevant to those consumers and highlighting those things that make it more accessible. But then we'll also be looking into innovation for inspiration and new ways to bring pork to those consumers to meet that convenience and versatility requirement.
So real quick add on, Kirsten said this, but I want to drive it home. Embedded in her response was the generational differences. Like twice she referenced snacks. It's really important beyond just the fresh versus processed is all else equal, younger generations have more eating occasions. It's less likely to be the breakfast, lunch, and dinner, sit down, have a center of the plate approach, regardless of the meat protein we're talking about. It's much more likely the meat protein is an ingredient into a smaller eating occasion. And that's important to keep in mind whether we're talking the current world of processed or fresh. And this team's well aware of that, but I want to give the attendees today that important context because that's a big part of this broader generational shift that's been talked about quite a bit.
Thanks for that. Let's move to Chet and his question about working directly with large retailers on the new campaign and how that might look.
Yeah, I can take that one, Jesse. So we are certainly ready and able to work with retailers. And what we're doing is really, again, starting with data to understand what your specific objectives might be, because not every retailer or not every market is created equal. And we're going to start with data to understand what your specific goals are for your meat department, for your pork sales, and then we will bring the campaign to support that specific need and objective. So we have within the tool set a lot of different things that can be leveraged. If you want to make sure that you're not leaking to other retailers, we've got some thoughts on how you might do some marketing in store to accomplish that and use the new campaign to help bring those consumers to your store. If you want to make sure that you get people in the store buying more often and reduce the purchase cycle between the time that they're in there buying pork products, we've got different marketing activities and tactics that will help you bring them back to purchase, for example, chops more often throughout the year. So it really is a case-by-case basis, and our teams are ready to sit down and really understand what you're trying to accomplish and bring some of our own perspective to that based on some of the work that we've been doing in these key areas. And then we will be ready to support it with the marketing materials and with any of the assets that you've seen here today, plus a whole lot more to, again, position and make pork most relevant to those consumers. I want to point out with that, we've talked a lot about Gen Z and millennials, and yes, they're really important. But we also made sure throughout this entire process and throughout all of the consumer testing that Taste What Pork Could Do, it was relevant to all consumer groups, to all of the segments, and to all generations. So I've really honed in, and Glenn as well, on Gen Z and millennial, but all of this can be leveraged to target your current consumer, your core pork consumer, the boomers and the Gen Xers who tend to be left out of a lot of these conversations. But ultimately, we would love to sit down with retailers to talk to them about, again, their specific needs and then help them build a program that works for them.
Great, Kirsten. As we come up on the top of the hour here and we wrap up everything, I want to thank everyone for joining. I want to encourage producers' patience in this process. This is a great big ship that won't turn overnight. I want to encourage your participation in the campaign. Certainly want to welcome everyone to the World Pork Expo in a couple of weeks. That'll be another great opportunity to learn more about the campaign and have a better understanding of what you can do as a producer and your call to action, as Jennifer pointed out in her question, relative to what producers can do. But I think more than anything, I would encourage patience. I would encourage understanding of the data and the research behind this, and really just encourage your support as an organization as we work through this new effort. If you aren't subscribed to the National Pork Board and the Pork Checkoff, I would encourage you to use the QR code on screen and be part of that list and provide your information so that you can be up to date on everything that's happening at the National Pork Board. And with that, thank you, Dr. Tonzer from K-State, Kirsten Hafer with Business Intelligence at the National Pork Board. Thank you for your contributions today on this webinar. Again, we look forward to seeing all of you at the World Pork Expo in a couple weeks. Thanks for joining today.